Army, welcome back to K-Pop Fact Today. There are voices that disappear when the music stops, and there are voices that remain suspended in the mind long after the final note has vanished. In the enormous world of Korean pop music, vocal beauty is not determined by range alone. A technically impressive singer may still fail to create an identity, while another voice, perhaps imperfect by conventional standards, can become recognizable within only a few seconds. This ranking examines 7 male K-pop soloists whose voices possess unusually strong identities, considering tone, resonance, register, phrasing, emotional color, versatility, and the way their voices have evolved throughout their careers. The order is not presented as an absolute scientific measurement because there is no universal instrument capable of declaring one human voice objectively the best in the world. Instead, it follows the distinctive qualities that make these singers difficult to confuse with anyone else. Behind every note lies a history of training, artistic decisions, physical vocal characteristics, and moments when a voice became something larger than the person producing it. And once those voices are separated from the lights, choreography, and fame, a more complicated question begins to emerge. What actually makes a voice unforgettable?
Position number 7, Shin Hyo-sob, the voice known as Crush. Late at night, when Seoul becomes quieter and the brightness of the enormous buildings begins to soften against the darkness, there is a particular kind of voice that seems designed for that hour. It does not need an arena to establish its presence. It does not need a dramatic opening note. Sometimes all it requires is a sparse arrangement, a restrained beat, and a microphone positioned close enough to capture the movement of breath between words. Shin Hyo-sob, better known professionally as Crush, occupies that territory. His voice is not built around the conventional image of the explosive idol vocalist. Instead, its strength lies in intimacy, texture, rhythm, and the ability to make a relatively restrained performance feel emotionally heavy. That distinction matters when discussing what makes a singer memorable. The human ear does not respond only to pitch accuracy or vocal range. It also responds to timbre, dynamics, articulation, phrasing, and the subtle differences between one person's voice and another's. Crush has developed an identity around precisely those characteristics. His vocal color can move between soft, almost conversational delivery and fuller R&B projection without losing its central personality. The effect is particularly powerful because he often leaves space around the voice rather than filling every second with sound. In many of his performances, silence becomes part of the arrangement. The listener is not simply hearing a singer perform notes. The listener is hearing someone shape the emotional distance between those notes. This is one reason his voice has become closely associated with Korean R&B and contemporary soul. The deeper mystery is that his appeal cannot easily be reduced to one register or one technical trick. His artistry depends heavily on interpretation. The same lyric can sound vulnerable in one setting, restrained in another, and quietly confident somewhere else. That flexibility is difficult to quantify because it belongs partly to musical judgment rather than anatomy. Vocal discussions frequently focus on high notes, but a singer can possess extraordinary control without constantly reaching the highest possible pitch. Crush demonstrates another definition of vocal power, the ability to control how much sound the listener receives. His lower and middle tones can create warmth, while his lighter upper delivery introduces vulnerability without completely abandoning the rhythmic character of the song. His pronunciation also contributes to his identity. Rather than treating words as merely carriers for melody, he often uses consonants, breath, and subtle rhythmic delays to make the vocal line feel physically connected to the groove. This is especially important in R&B, where timing can become almost as expressive as pitch. The history of his career also provides an important clue. As an artist who has moved between solo releases, collaborations, soundtracks, and different forms of contemporary Korean popular music, his voice has repeatedly been placed in contrasting environments, yet it tends to remain recognizable. That consistency is one of the strongest indicators of a distinctive vocal identity. A listener may not immediately know the title of a song, but the vocal texture can reveal the artist before the arrangement does. This is different from saying that every performance is technically flawless. No serious vocal analysis should make such a claim. Recorded music also involves microphones, mixing, compression, layering, and other production choices that can alter how a voice is perceived. What remains significant is the consistency of the artistic identity behind those tools. Crush has created a vocal world in which softness does not mean weakness, restraint does not mean lack of intensity, and emotional depth does not require theatrical excess. His voice often feels as though it is speaking directly into the listener's private space, rather than projecting toward a distant crowd. That quality has helped him establish as one of the most recognizable male voices in modern Korean R&B. The question, however, remains unresolved. If a voice can command attention without ever needing to shout, how powerful can silence become when the right singer controls it?
Position number 6, Taemin, the voice that changed with time. There was a period in SHINee's early history when Taemin was primarily associated with another form of performance. His dancing was immediately visible, while his singing developed more gradually, almost as if the vocal identity audiences know today had not yet been fully revealed. The passage of time changed that equation. Years later, the voice that emerged was lighter, more controlled, and considerably more confident, creating one of the clearest examples of vocal development among major K-pop performers. Taemin's story is therefore not simply a story about possessing a beautiful voice. It is a story about what happens when an artist spends years learning how to inhabit a voice that initially seemed less naturally prepared for the demands placed upon it. Earlier vocal analyses have described Taemin as a light lyric tenor and have noted consistency in his mixed register, particularly around the upper middle portion of his range. One historical analysis placed his recorded range approximately from G2 to B5, while emphasizing that range alone should not be confused with supported or consistently resonant singing. That distinction is essential. Anyone can encounter an impressive, isolated note online, but a singer's real development is revealed by what happens repeatedly under different conditions across years of performance. Taemin's vocal evolution became particularly fascinating because he did not simply attempt to imitate the larger, heavier voices surrounding him. His instrument retained a naturally lighter character. Instead of eliminating that characteristic, he increasingly learned how to use it. The result is a sound that can appear almost weightless in one moment and unexpectedly firm in another. His voice often carries a youthful brightness, but his mature solo work introduces darker textures, breathier colors, and more controlled emotional restraint. This contrast became especially important as his musical identity moved further into solo territory. His songs frequently demand that singing function together with choreography, atmosphere, and dramatic interpretation. That creates a unique physical challenge. A vocal performance is no longer occurring in a stationary environment where every breath can be carefully prepared. The singer must coordinate movement, timing, resonance, and emotional expression simultaneously. Taemin's development is notable partly because his voice gradually became more dependable within that demanding environment. Earlier assessments of his singing described a relatively stable mixed register and considerable improvement over time, but perhaps the more important transformation occurred beyond technical measurements. Taemin developed a vocal identity that became inseparable from the atmosphere of his music. His delivery can sound intimate even when the production is enormous. A phrase may be sung with relatively modest volume, but still create a sense of tension because the tone itself carries vulnerability. His lighter vocal color also gives his songs a particular contrast against darker electronic arrangements. Instead of overpowering the production, his voice can appear to float above it. That characteristic has become one of his greatest artistic assets. There is another reason his voice deserves attention: recognizability. In an industry where singers frequently operate inside heavily layered productions, a distinctive timbre is difficult to manufacture. Training can improve support, pitch control, breathing, and coordination, but the fundamental color of a human voice remains deeply individual. Taemin's voice has retained its recognizable core despite years of stylistic experimentation. He can sing in darker, sensual, theatrical, or emotionally restrained settings without completely losing that identity. The paradox is that his apparent delicacy can become a source of strength. A heavier voice may dominate a track immediately, but a lighter voice can create a different form of tension by making the listener lean closer. Taemin's career therefore raises an unusual question about vocal greatness. Is the strongest singer always the one capable of producing the largest sound? Or can greatness emerge from someone who learns precisely how much sound is necessary? His evolution suggests that vocal identity is not a fixed possession. It can be built, refined, challenged, and transformed. The boy, once known primarily for movement, eventually became a soloist whose voice could carry an entire atmosphere by itself. And perhaps the most mysterious part of that transformation is not where his voice began, but how far it had to travel before the world finally recognized what it could become.
Position number 5, Jimin, the voice that refuses to stay in one shape. The lights are low, the instrumental is barely moving. Then a voice appears that seems almost too delicate for the scale of the room. It is not the kind of entrance that depends on brute force. Instead, it arrives through texture, breath, brightness, slight rasp, controlled tension, and an unmistakable upper registered color. Jimin's voice has long occupied a particularly unusual position within BTS because it can sound fragile and powerful almost simultaneously. That contradiction is one of the reasons his singing remains so recognizable. Vocal identity is often built from a combination of physical timbre and artistic interpretation, and Jimin's career demonstrates how dramatically those two elements can interact. His voice has a naturally high, light quality, but his solo work has increasingly shown that he is not restricted to that familiar image. Weverse magazine's discussion of his album Face specifically noted the contrast between the deeper opening of Alone, the emotionally heightened passages of Like Crazy, and the harder R&B character used in Face Off. That variety is important because it shows that Jimin's recognizable sound is not simply a matter of singing high. It is the ability to reshape the same basic instrument according to emotional context. In one recording, the voice can become breathy and intimate. In another, it can become sharper and more dramatic. Somewhere else, it may descend into a darker tone that initially seems almost disconnected from the sound audiences associate with him. The effect can be disorienting, but that disorientation is part of his artistic strength. His voice does not always announce exactly what is coming next. His transition between registers has also become a recurring subject of discussion. Recent profiles have highlighted his ability to move between chest voice and falsetto while maintaining a recognizable tone, while producer P-Dog explained that Jimin's solo recordings deliberately explored a wider range than the high note role he often occupies in BTS arrangements. That detail reveals something significant. A singer can become trapped by the public's expectation of what their voice is supposed to sound like. Jimin has increasingly challenged that expectation. The most interesting evidence appears when his solo work is placed beside his his group performances. In BTS, the arrangement uses his upper register as a distinctive color. In his solo work, however, producers have deliberately explored lower notes, falsetto, and contrasting textures. The result is a broader vocal palette. Yet Jimin's greatest asset may not be range at all. It may be emotional immediacy. His voice often carries the sensation of being extremely close to the listener. Breath can remain audible, endings may soften rather than terminate sharply. Certain consonants appear almost whispered, creating an impression that the lyric is being delivered privately rather than publicly. This quality can be extremely difficult to reproduce because it depends on the relationship between vocal technique and emotional intention. Too much breath can destabilize pitch. Too little can destroy the intimacy. Too much pressure can make the voice sound forced. Too little can make it disappear inside the arrangement. The challenge is therefore one of balance. Jimin's vocal evolution has not erased those tensions. Rather, it has made them part of his artistic language. His voice can sound beautiful precisely because it contains contrasts. There is brightness and darkness, softness and attack, vulnerability and control. The public often describes distinctive singers using simple words such as unique, but uniqueness is not a technical measurement. It is the cumulative effect of many small choices. Jimin's choices have produced a vocal signature that remains identifiable even when the genre changes around him. This becomes especially evident in his solo catalog, where R&B, pop, disco-influenced production, and darker electronic textures require different approaches. His ability to adapt without becoming unrecognizable is one of the reasons his voice remains compelling. Still, there is an unresolved question surrounding every technically complex voice. How much of its magic belongs to anatomy and how much belongs to the person controlling it? Perhaps Jimin's voice is difficult to imitate not because of one impossible note, but because every breath, transition, and emotional fracture forms part of an identity that cannot simply be copied.
Position number 4, G-Dragon, the voice that broke the rules. Long before the lights of a modern stage settle into their final configuration, the sound has already begun. A beat emerges, a rhythm appears, then a voice enters that does not behave like a conventional singer's voice and does not behave entirely like a rapper's voice either. G-Dragon has built one of the most immediately recognizable vocal identities in Korean popular music precisely because he has never depended on fitting neatly into one category. He is a rapper, singer, songwriter, producer, and performer whose vocal identity has always been intertwined with attitude, rhythm, phrasing, and character. That makes evaluating his voice particularly difficult. If the question were simply who can produce the highest note, G-Dragon would not be the obvious candidate. But if the question becomes whose voice can be identified almost immediately because of its personality, the calculation changes. Soompi previously highlighted G-Dragon among K-pop's most unique voices, describing the recognizable high-pitched quality of his rap and vocalizations, as well as the breathier character of his lower register. More recent vocal commentary similarly describes him as a chameleon-like performer who moves between rap cadence, melodic singing, and falsetto, arguing that his phrasing and tonal shifts are more central to his identity than raw vocal range. This distinction is crucial. G-Dragon does not always treat his voice as a neutral instrument designed to produce a beautiful note. He treats it as a dramatic character. Sometimes it sounds deliberately thin, sometimes nasal, sometimes breathy, sometimes sharp enough to cut through a dense production, sometimes almost conversational. Those choices might be criticized if judged only through the narrow standards of classical vocal technique, but popular music operates under a different artistic logic. Timbre itself can become composition. A singer can intentionally choose an unusual sound because that sound communicates personality more effectively than a conventionally perfect tone. G-Dragon's voice frequently does exactly that. In his most recognizable performances, rhythm and vocal texture become inseparable. He may stretch a syllable beyond where a listener expects it, abruptly change intensity, or move from speech-like delivery into melody. The transition itself becomes part of the hook. That is why attempting to isolate his vocal ability from his songwriting and performance style can produce an incomplete picture. The voice is embedded in the architecture of the song. His use of breath is another important element. The lower, relaxed quality often creates a sense of distance, while higher or more projected passages can suddenly make the performance feel confrontational. This creates a psychological movement even before the lyrics are fully understood. His voice can sound arrogant, vulnerable, exhausted, playful, rebellious, or emotionally detached, depending on the arrangement and delivery. That degree of characterization is not easy to quantify, but listeners recognize it almost instinctively. His role in Big Bang also contributed to the formation of this identity. Within a group containing multiple strong vocal colors, G-Dragon's voice often functioned as an immediate contrast. He did not need to sound like a traditional main vocalist because his contribution was something else: unpredictability. His entrances could alter the emotional temperature of an entire song. His rap could be followed by singing, then by a vocalized phrase that blurred the boundary between both. This is perhaps where his greatest vocal strength lies. He makes categories unstable. Rap becomes singing, singing becomes speech, falsetto becomes an emotional effect rather than simply a register, and unusual pronunciation becomes part of melody. Yet this same unpredictability is why rankings of his voice remain controversial. Traditional vocal analysis may prioritize consistent support, resonance, register development, and technical efficiency. G-Dragon's artistry often prioritizes color, phrasing, identity, and emotional character. Neither framework completely explains the phenomenon. A voice can be technically strong and still forgettable. Another can contain technical limitations and still become iconic. G-Dragon belongs to the second category in a particularly powerful way. His voice has become inseparable from the artistic world he created around it. It is difficult to imagine some of his most famous songs with another performer, because replacing the voice would alter the personality of the music itself. That is perhaps the highest form of vocal individuality. The voice is no longer merely performing the song. The voice becomes part of the song's identity. And when an artist reaches that point, the old question of whether the voice is technically perfect begins to sound almost irrelevant. The more disturbing question becomes, if the personality disappeared from the voice, would the music still be recognizable at all?
Position number 3, Taehyung, the baritone that changed the color of BTS. The room is almost silent before the first low note appears. It does not rise into the air like a typical male idol vocal. Instead, it seems to settle downward, creating weight before the melody has even fully begun. This is one of the most distinctive characteristics of Kim Taehyung, whose voice has often been singled out for its unusually deep and warm color within the vocal landscape of BTS. In an industry where male idol groups frequently favor higher voices capable of navigating demanding melodic lines, Taehyung's lower vocal identity immediately created contrast. His voice has often been described as baritone-like, and recent analysis has placed his recorded range approximately around E2 to C5, while emphasizing the naturally low tessitura and warm resonance associated with his instrument. The precise classification of any living singer should be approached cautiously, because voice types are more complicated than a simple range chart. Historical vocal analysis discussions have also warned that young singers should not be rigidly categorized because voices continue to mature over time. But regardless of terminology, one fact is difficult to dispute. Taehyung's vocal color is unusually recognizable. It has a depth that immediately separates him from many male K-pop singers. That depth is not merely about singing low. A low note without resonance can sound empty or weak. What makes Taehyung interesting is the combination of pitch, timbre, breath, and emotional restraint. His voice can carry a smoky quality without becoming completely opaque. It can sound warm without losing clarity. It can also become surprisingly light when he moves upward, creating a contrast between the dark foundation of his lower register and the softer color of his upper delivery. This contrast became increasingly important in his solo career. Rather than simply reproducing the vocal role audiences already knew from BTS, his solo work allowed him to explore genres and textures that were more naturally compatible with his vocal character.
Jazz, soul, R&B, pop, and vintage-inspired arrangements provide more space for a lower voice to breathe. Instead of competing with dense electronic layers, his voice can sit inside the arrangement as a texture of its own. That is one reason his vocal identity often feels cinematic. There is a sense of physical space around the sound. His phrasing can be deliberately slow, allowing the end of a note to remain audible after the main body of the phrase has already disappeared. That restraint produces an unusual emotional effect. A singer who constantly pushes forward can create excitement, but a singer who knows how to hold back can create tension. Taehyung's voice often lives inside that tension. He does not need to attack every phrase. Sometimes the emotional meaning emerges from the fact that he refuses to overstate it. His vocal color also has a visual quality. This may sound subjective, but it is one reason listeners often associate his singing with nighttime settings, dim rooms, vintage microphones, and intimate stages. The voice itself creates imagery. This is not something that can be completely taught. Training can improve breath management, pitch accuracy, diction, and coordination, but timbre remains deeply personal. The lower resonance that defines Taehyung's sound is part of his natural instrument, while his artistic choices determine how that instrument is presented. His solo performances therefore reveal an important distinction between vocal ability and vocal identity. A singer does not need to demonstrate every possible technical capability to establish mastery. Sometimes mastery means understanding exactly which parts of your instrument should be placed in the foreground. Taehyung frequently emphasizes the qualities that make his voice different rather than attempting to disguise them. This has allowed him to occupy a rare position among globally recognized K-pop singers. The voice is recognizable not because it is the loudest, highest, or most acrobatic, but because it has a color that listeners can identify almost immediately. And yet, the mystery remains. Why does a relatively simple phrase sound more expensive, more intimate, or more emotionally distant when it comes from that particular voice? Perhaps the answer is not hidden inside the note itself. Perhaps it is hidden inside everything the listener expects to hear when that voice arrives.
Position number 2, Jungkook, the voice built for adaptation. In the middle of a vast concert venue surrounded by thousands of voices and the mechanical pressure of a modern pop production, one question repeatedly returns. Whenever Jungkook begins to sing, what allows a voice to remain recognizable while changing its shape so easily? His position near the top of this ranking is not based simply on the popularity of BTS or the enormous scale of his solo career. It is based on adaptability. Jungkook's voice has repeatedly been placed inside different genres, languages, production styles, and performance conditions, while retaining a recognizable center. That quality is particularly valuable in contemporary pop music because versatility is often harder to achieve than range. A singer can reach an impressive note once, but adapting the same instrument to R&B, pop, rock-influenced production, dance music, ballad arrangements, and stripped-down performances requires a broader form of control. Jungkook's solo catalog has demonstrated that flexibility. His voice can become bright and youthful, then darker and more textured, then clean and direct, depending on what the song requires. The central characteristic is not one spectacular register, but a balance between accessibility and technical ambition. His vocal tone generally has enough brightness to cut through dense arrangements, while his lower and middle registers provide enough weight to prevent the voice from sounding one-dimensional. This becomes especially important during live performances, where the difference between a studio vocal and a physically demanding stage can expose weaknesses that production can otherwise conceal. The public image of Jungkook as a powerful singer is partly connected to those high-energy performances, but the more interesting aspect is what happens when he deliberately reduces the amount of force. In quieter moments, the voice becomes softer without completely losing its core tone.
That suggests that his vocal identity does not depend entirely on volume. Another important characteristic is his ability to move between full voice, mixed coordination, and lighter upper register production. The transitions may not always be perfectly uniform because no singer maintains identical coordination across every live performance, but the overall flexibility remains one of his defining strengths. This is where vocal analysis must separate isolated imperfections from long-term ability. Every live singer encounters fatigue, acoustical limitations, movement, monitoring problems, and changing physical conditions. A serious assessment should therefore look at patterns rather than viral clips. Jungkook's pattern is one of continued experimentation. His solo releases expanded his musical identity beyond the familiar BTS framework, allowing his voice to interact with mainstream pop structures that demanded a more direct, internationally oriented delivery. His English language material also required attention to pronunciation and phrasing that differs from Korean language singing. Yet he was able to maintain enough of his natural vocal color for listeners to recognize him. That balance between adaptation and identity is difficult. Change too much, and the singer becomes unrecognizable. Change too little, and versatility becomes an illusion. Jungkook has generally occupied the middle ground. There is also an interesting psychological element to his vocal style. His singing often feels immediate rather than heavily theatrical. Even when the melody reaches a demanding point, the delivery can retain a sense of conversational clarity. That quality makes the voice accessible to listeners who may not analyze technique consciously. They simply feel that the singer sounds close. At the same time, his more powerful performances reveal a different side of the instrument, one capable of carrying large choruses and sustaining the energy of a stadium setting. The question is whether versatility should outrank uniqueness. Some singers have voices that are instantly identifiable because they are unusual. Jungkook's voice is distinctive partly because it can adapt without losing its identity. That is a different kind of rarity. His instrument does not have to remain in one shape to remain recognizable. It can bend according to the music and still return to the same central color. That is why his voice has become one of the most commercially and artistically adaptable male voices associated with modern K-pop. But if versatility places him this high, then another mystery remains. What happens when a voice capable of becoming almost anything finally reveals the one sound that belongs only to itself?
Position number 1, Baekhyun, the voice that turns technique into identity. The stage is dark. The first instruments are barely audible. Then the vocal line arrives bright enough to cut through the arrangement, but controlled enough to avoid disappearing into pure volume. There is something immediately identifiable about Baekhyun's voice, a combination of brightness, masculine warmth, upper register flexibility, and an ability to shift between emotional delicacy and stronger projection. Among male K-pop soloists, he represents a particularly compelling intersection between vocal technique and artistic identity. His career with EXO established him as one of the group's principal vocal colors, while his solo work allowed that voice to exist without being surrounded by 6 other singers competing for sonic space. That separation reveals an important fact. A voice that works inside a group does not automatically become an effective solo voice. In a group arrangement, another member may fill the low register, another may provide a powerful belt, and another may contribute a contrasting tone. A soloist must carry the entire emotional architecture alone. Baekhyun has repeatedly demonstrated an ability to do that. Historical vocal analysis has described him as a light lyric tenor, noting a bright masculine quality, extensive recorded range, developed upper register, and significant improvement in breath support and control over his career. That same analysis estimated a recorded range around F-sharp 2 to C-sharp 6, while explicitly distinguishing his broader range from the smaller portion that could be considered consistently supported.
This distinction should not be ignored. Vocal range charts can be impressive but misleading if isolated notes are treated as proof of complete technical mastery. The more meaningful evidence lies in consistency, resonance, transition between registers, pitch control, phrasing, and the ability to reproduce a vocal effect under different conditions. Baekhyun's development is particularly interesting because his voice has always possessed a naturally bright quality that allows it to remain audible inside dense arrangements. That brightness can become an advantage in high passages because the tone carries forward rather than disappearing into the instrumentation. His upper register, including his use of falsetto, has also been one of the most recognizable aspects of his vocal identity. Yet his appeal is not limited to high notes. His middle register carries the warmth necessary for R&B and ballad material, while his softer delivery can create an intimate atmosphere that is almost opposite to the image of a singer simply demonstrating power. This versatility is central to his position. The best evidence is often found in the way his voice changes color depending on the musical environment. In one setting, he can sound polished and bright. In another, he can sound darker and more vulnerable. He can use a lighter head voice, then return to a fuller middle register without making the contrast feel like two completely different singers. Such transitions are not effortless by default. They require coordination between breath, vocal fold closure, resonance, and vowel shaping, and the quality of those transitions often separate an experienced singer from someone who simply possesses a naturally attractive voice. Historical vocal commentary on Baekhyun also emphasized his development over time, particularly in pitch, support, placement, and upper register control. This makes his story more significant than a simple claim that he was born talented. Natural vocal characteristics certainly matter, but the instrument must still be trained. A beautiful voice without control can become inconsistent. A technically trained voice without personality can become forgettable. Baekhyun's strength lies in the combination. His voice possesses an identifiable color, but he has also learned how to manipulate that color according to the emotional demands of a song. His solo career further clarified this identity. Without the need to constantly contrast with other EXO members, the listener can hear the full spectrum of his approach: airy passages, stronger belts, controlled falsetto, intimate R&B textures, and more dramatic climaxes. His voice can therefore operate as instrument and character. There is a reason listeners often recognize him within seconds. Recognition comes not merely from pitch or range, but from the specific relationship between brightness, resonance, vowel color, breath, and phrasing. That combination becomes a vocal fingerprint. No ranking can scientifically prove that Baekhyun possesses the best voice in the world, because beauty remains partly subjective, and vocal excellence has many dimensions. But if the question is which singer from this list most convincingly combines recognizable timbre, technical development, versatility, upper register ability, and the capacity to carry an entire song as a solo artist, Baekhyun presents one of the strongest cases. The mystery surrounding his voice is therefore not whether he can reach a particular note. The more fascinating question is why, after the note has ended and the production has gone silent, the color of that voice can remain in the listener's memory. Perhaps that is the point where technique stops being merely technique and becomes identity.